With Battlefield 1 fast approaching, I thought it wise to start educating myself on what actually happened during World War I, which of course is the setting for this game. It's not the World War that most people will know a lot about, and likely when you were in school, you learn a little bit more about the Second World War. And so I thought I'd bring you along on my learning mission and bring you some stories of some of the biggest or most interesting aspects of the war. And today, we're going to look at the Battle of the Somme, which for many symbolised the horrors of the war and to an extent wrongly became the picture of what people actually thought the whole war was. It's probably the vision that you've got of World War I in your head: trench warfare, muddy battlefields and sustained artillery fire. The Battle of the Somme started on July 1st, 1916 and lasted all the way through until November that same year. It was recorded as one of the bloodiest battles of the war, the largest on the Western Front, with a total of over 1 million soldiers dying during the course of the conflict. The aim of the battle was to weaken the German army and force them to retreat, whilst giving the French forces some relief from the fighting that they were doing over in Verdun, where many of their soldiers had been diverted earlier in the year. The idea was not to stop the French attacking at Verdun, but to force the Germans to split their numbers and spread them further across the front, which weakened them by numbers and allowed the Allied forces to inflict as much damage as possible against the Germans. Now, the idea to actually attack at the Somme was not met by a great response by the head of the French army and nor by the British commanders at the time. They felt the attack would achieve very little, and so it turned out they were precisely right. The Battle of the Somme not only became the bloodiest battle ever fought on the Western Front, but it also highlighted the futility of trench warfare. Over the 141 days of battle, the Allied forces only captured 7 miles of enemy territory and failed to break through the strong German defences. The start of the battle was signalled with almost continuous shelling of the German lines with Allied field gun fire. Over 1.5 million shells were fired during this time, which lasted about a week. The aim was to obliterate the German defences, which consisted of deep dug trenches going down further than most others that had been built at the time, their bomb-proof shelters, and barbed wire stretches sometimes up to 40 yards in depth. The thinking was that this continued shelling would remove all of the barriers to the German fighters that were in the trenches, and that would allow the Allied forces to go over the top and capture as much ground as they possibly could. Now, it didn't quite turn out that way. The Germans worked out the tactic and simply sat back and waited in their bomb-proof shelters, in those really deep trenches. They just waited until the shelling stopped, and then they would simply prepare for an Allied attack. The first day of the battle set the story for the rest of the conflict. Extreme numbers of casualties for the British, nearly 20,000 soldiers losing their lives in one day. That becoming the bloodiest in the history of the British Army. Here's a quote as to what the scene actually looked like after the first day from a gentleman called George Coppard, who was a machine gunner in the British Army. The next morning, we gunners surveyed the dreadful scene in front of us. It became clear that the Germans always had a commanding view of no man's land. Our attack had been brutally repulsed. Hundreds of dead were strung out like wreckage washed up to a high watermark. Quite as many dead on the enemy wire as on the ground, like fish caught in a net. They hung there in grotesque postures, some looking as if they were praying. They died on their knees and the wire had prevented their fall. Machine gun fire had done its terrible work. Now, just over a month after the battle started, a film was made by the War Office back in the United Kingdom depicting the battle taking place over in France. Media reports of the battle had been very positive, despite the huge losses and the information coming back home that loved ones were being lost day after day. The film, called The Battle of the Somme, used actual footage from the war and gave a major push towards the British public supporting the conflict, despite the fact those heavy losses were incurred every single day of the war. With all the names going back home of dead Allied soldiers, by the end of August 2016, the Germans had suffered nearly 250,000 casualties overall. Morale was so low that it caused the German general to resign from his post. The Germans at the start of the war had a huge industrial advantage, with weaponry and supplies being far greater than what the Allies could muster. Now though, by this point, the Allies were backed by the Americans, which came with greater power in weaponry. A new general was appointed by the Germans, his name was Hindenburg, and he employed new tactics. The German soldiers were instructed to concede ground to the attacking forces in order to set themselves up better somewhere else to inflict greater overall damage. By this point, the Germans knew the ground they'd lost was not all that important, as the Allies had hardly eaten into the ground they'd held before the conflict anyway. Over the following 3 months, the battle saw the dawn of the technological age, with the introduction of the British Mark I tank and the Germans' continued innovation in the skies with their fighter planes. The Mark I tank provided a massive morale boost to the Allied troops. Suddenly, they had this gigantic metal monster rolling across no man's land right next to them as they went over the top to assault the German trenches. During the Somme, though, only 15 of the 36 initial tanks made it to the front line, but it still allowed the Allies to advance around 1.5 miles because of its introduction. As for the skies, at the start of the battle, the Allies had always had the edge, providing them with better vision of the front and relaying important information back to the troops on the ground. The Germans had continually improved their fighters over the course of the war, and during September 1916, they deployed a set of new aircraft. The Fokker D2 and the Albatros fighter planes outclassed what the Allies could then offer, which allowed the Germans to push back against the assault on the ground. At this point, the French actually retaliated against the German infantry push, and they set up artillery shellings and machine gun nests, which ultimately halted the assault. By the end of September 1916, the Allied forces felt the end of the conflict might be in sight. They captured both Morval and Thiepval Ridge, forcing the Germans back even further. Their captures are said to have been mainly attributed to the perfection of the creeping barrage, which was a tactic that saw the Allies fire artillery shells just in front of their advancing infantry, with the hope that this would provide some much-needed cover when they went over the top into no man's land. Throughout October, the Allies saw further large numbers of casualties despite the fact they took very little ground from the Germans, and this was mainly due to the horrific weather conditions, which hindered visibility of all of the soldiers out there on the battlefield. On November 13th, the end of the battle was very near, and what was considered the last true battle of the Somme took place, with the Allies' creeping barrage tactic working to great effect, and that allowed the British and the French armies to capture over 7,000 German prisoners and covering some serious ground for the first time in nearly a month. By the 19th of November, the harsh winter weather was so extreme, the British called a halt to their assault and planned to resume conflict in February 1917. But the Germans actually retreated after sustaining casualties of nearly 500,000 men in the months before. There's no doubt that the Battle of the Somme was a pivotal point in the First World War, proving on both sides that trench warfare just wasn't going to produce the results that either wanted. Millions of men fought to push either side of the conflict, ultimately resulting in the German retreat. The Allies can never class the battle as a success, as they never managed to penetrate the defences they faced, only taking 7 miles in 141 days of conflict. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed learning something along with me today. I'll be posting more of these stories on our lead up to the launch of Battlefield 1, and not just those that take place on the Western Front. So if you really did enjoy today's video, let me know by leaving a like, and I'll be sure to bring you some more stories soon. But until next time, my name is Westie, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.